Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Hunger Hunt Feast. Today, I want to talk about animal-based diet. The animal-based diet, which is basically, meat and eggs, right? Um, and its correlation to heart disease and cancer risks or benefit. Is a greater risk or benefit? What do current studies tell us? So I'm going to briefly go over just a few studies that have come out in recent, most of them since 2018. There's a couple that go back to a little farther back, but little synopsis from what they each found, and kind of paint a picture for what we can take away. We can draw your own conclusions. You're going to get mine, of course, but to just I won't say tell a story, but I think we can pull some of these studies to conclusions together, see what they found, and draw a reasonable conclusion about really whether or not you want to follow an animal-based diet, or if that is too great a risk for health versus the benefits of weight loss and body composition that we all know comes from an animal-based diet. So let's get into this, because I've got a few to go through here, and I will try to keep it quick. I'm not going to dive deep into these, but you'll get the understanding of what these researchers found. And again, these are very current studies. There's first one from July of 2020. A high protein diet more effectively reduces hepatic fat, so it's liver fat, effectively reduces hepatic fat than a low protein diet, despite lower autophagy and lower what's called FGF21 levels, which is another hormone that is related to glucose tolerance, essentially controlling blood sugar. So high protein diet more effectively reduces liver fat than a low protein diet, despite the fact that there is less autophagy or less cellular turnover because of the high protein, right? It's stimulating mTOR. And that's a big fear. Oh, it's too much mTOR. It's going to, cause too much growth. Actually, what happened, again, July of 2020, just last year ago, the liver fat, what they suggest, what their conclusion was, that the high protein diet reduced liver fat as a result, primarily because of the suppression of fat uptake and fat creation, or lipid biosynthesis, which could include triglycerides as well, and cholesterol. So there was less fat uptake, less fat storage, less fat production from the liver in terms of triglycerides and LDL and stuff on a high protein diet, versus a low protein diet didn't have the same reduction of liver fat or liver or fat lipid production, essentially. Okay, so fatty liver is a big deal, especially non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Probably 25+% of the population. And if you start Googling around, start asking doctors, you'll say, oh, well, there's no real cure for it. It's because they don't have a medicine, they don't have a prescription for it, right? There's no medicine for it. It's purely the only way to reverse it is dietary, because it's a dietary disease, usually driven by fructose, alcohol, of course, generally just a high processed food diet, including the seed oils, the polyunsaturated oils that are produced from like soy, canola, corn. They're in all the processed foods, right? So sugar, those oils, alcohol will drive that through, and as well as inflammation. So high protein diet's reducing that. Okay, and high protein diet's only pretty much going to come from, right, an animal-based diet. So next study was from August of 2020. This is actually it was in the Journal of American College of Cardiology. Okay, published in that. Saturated Fats and Health: A Reassessment and Proposal for Food-Based Recommendations. A Journal of American College of Cardiology state-of-the-art review. And one of the people involved in this review is a man named Ron Krause, PhD, MD, very involved in nutrition, child nutrition as an MD, and or children's health, I should say, child nutrition specifically, but children's health. And he sat on the board of the USDA that making the when they made the nutrition guidelines. I believe it was 2005, possibly 2010 as well. They do it every 5 years. But he's been on that. He sat on that council and could not could not budge them in their in making these changes. But he is part of this review, basically saying the recommendation to limit saturated fat intake has continued, has persisted, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Most recent meta-analysis of randomized trials and observational studies found no beneficial effects of reducing saturated fat intake on cardiovascular disease and total mortality. So in total, and not just in cardiovascular disease, but in greatest risk of death by all causes. Okay, and instead found protective effects against stroke. So saturated fatty acids, saturated fat, dietary saturated fat, protective against strokes. I think I've shared that study before. Whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, and dark chocolate are saturated fat rich foods with a complex matrix that are not associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. The total availability of evidence does not support further limiting the intake of such foods. There's no evidence to support limiting saturated fat from sources like whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, and dark chocolate. In other words, from real food. Okay, we're not talking about the trans fats that are created from the processing of the seed oils, because those do create trans fats as they are put into foods and the heat and everything. They get oxidized, they become trans fats, and those are technically a saturated fat, or because they chemically turn them into trans fats on purpose to make them more stable. We're talking about naturally saturated fat, like there's an unprocessed meat, dark chocolate, whole fat dairy. No risk. There's no evidence to support limiting those foods for cardiovascular risk or all-cause mortality, any death by any cause. So we've got a decrease, so far we got a decrease in liver fat, which is a good thing. And no evidence that it causes, that saturated fat from the sources we're talking about causes cardiovascular risk. Meat and Human Health. This was published just last month, June 2021, June this year. Study done primarily by Denmark. There was one Spanish researcher involved as well from Spain. So a European study. Recent meta-analysis of both observational and randomized controlled trials. Understand the difference there. Observational is epidemiology, so asking questions, looking at health outcomes with some knowledge of diet or some knowledge of the lifestyle involved in the population. Okay, and then randomized controlled trials are much more, or trials that have weeded out some more of the variables, or much more, as it says, controlled, without randomized. So the people conducting the study are not supposed to know what's going on there, and neither are the people in the study, and aren't supposed to know who's getting what, as far as the control group versus the researchers, right? So, but it's randomized. It's like, okay, you randomly. I don't want to go over into this too much, but understand it's an experiment where there's less knowledge or control over the by the researchers. So there's less influence of bias, of their own personal bias. Okay, and they've weeded out some of the external variables that could affect the outcome, but are not related to what you're looking for. If that makes sense. So both observational and randomized controlled trials do not support any effect of saturated fat on cardiovascular disease or diabetes. The current evidence regarding the effect of meat consumption on health is potentially confounded, which means it's been confused. That means they've allowed too many variables in their studies. Too many variables like smoking, maybe lack of exercise, alcohol consumption, processed food, things that maybe put a poor light on, in this case, they're studying the effect of meat consumption, but they aren't meat consumption. They just confound the outcomes and they didn't extract those variables. So not a healthy lifestyle with meat consumption. Not just looking at that, but looking at all lifestyles, variable lifestyles. Could be smoking, could be drinking actually meat. You get the idea. There's a need for sufficiently powered, high quality trials assessing the health effects of meat consumption. That's so basically saying, really, if you look at it, there's no evidence that meat is anyway related to, or saturated fat is related to cardiovascular disease or diabetes. And the studies that are suggesting this are, again, they're over manipulated or compounded. They're just not well done. And we need some new ones, basically what they're saying. The next one, another one from June, that on low carbohydrate diets, low carb diets lead to greater weight loss and better glucose homeostasis than exercise. A randomized clinical trial. This is not an observational study. This is a clinical trial. Okay. So low carb diets did better than exercise for weight loss and glucose stability, stabilizing glucose levels. Now, this was a pilot study suggesting that the effects of a low carb diet and exercise are similar in alleviating liver steatosis and insulin resistance. So basically, liver fat and insulin resistance, so pre-diabetic symptoms. Compared to the exercise, low carb diet actually they found to be more efficient for weight loss and glucose control, or glucose homeostasis. So basically, losing weight and maintaining some insulin sensitivity in people with obesity. And they found greater reductions in both visceral fat and subcutaneous fat. So the liver fat, as well as the fat that's under the skin, that's kind of roly-poly, right? Around the middle and on the arms and legs. So once again, we've got more reduction in fat and better glucose control on a low carb diet. Not the diets were recommended with 60% coming from carbs. Okay. Low carb diet, which we're warned is harmful, right? And reduction and unnecessary, or doesn't make sense because a calorie is a calorie. Apparently not. Apparently a calorie isn't a calorie. Changes in blood lipid concentrations associated with changes in intake of dietary saturated fat in the context of a healthy low carbohydrate weight loss diet. This is a secondary analysis of the diet intervention examining what's called the diet. It was called the Diet Fits trial, which stands for Diet Intervention Examining the Factors Interacting with Treatment Success. That's a big title. So they called it Diet Fits. So, and they were looking at blood lipid concentration changes. So cholesterol, triglycerides, changes in that with a healthy low carb diet versus a healthy low fat diet, with the low carb diet actually taking in, not just because traditionally when they do these studies, they replace carbohydrates with unsaturated fat. This one allowed saturated fat. I think their intake was between 12 and 18% of calories from saturated fat. Now they looked at 600, a little over 609 healthy adults, generally healthy adults, ages 18 to 50. They replaced like I said, they usually replace carbs with unsaturated fat. This study looked at outcomes with an increase in saturated fat. So again, 12 to 18% of calories from saturated fat versus a healthy low fat diet. So they tried to make them similar, except that one was low fat, one was low carb, and they allowed saturated fats in the low carb diet. The low carb diet with the saturated fats intake had a decrease in triglycerides. So triglycerides went down, which is great, and an increase in HDL, which is awesome. And this suggested that their take on it was carbohydrate intake was a mediator, was the one that tipped the scale the other way versus the low-fat diet. Because carbohydrates were responsible for decreasing triglycerides, or basically the higher carb diet, low fat, higher carb, right, had higher decreased triglycerides, or higher triglycerides, and not as high of HDL levels. The low carb saturated fat diet had the greatest decrease in triglycerides and an increase in HDL. So that's better, right? When we look at, instead of looking at total, now we're going to look at a total cholesterol study here in a second. When you look at cholesterol, you can't just look at the total cholesterol number. You've got to look at your HDL triglyceride ratio, which is, this is what this is addressing. So when you have low HDL and high triglycerides, you're usually looking at an insulin resistant environment. You're looking at someone who is metabolically unhealthy at the very least. Okay, high triglycerides, low HDL. And those triglycerides can push up the LDL number. So we have to look at LDL quality, cholesterol quality. If you have high triglycerides and a low HDL, that's a bad quality. If you have higher HDL, lower triglycerides, ideally under, they'll say under 150, I would say under 100 on triglycerides, definitely want over 840 on HDL, as high as you can get them. Then you've got a much more insulin sensitive, much more metabolically healthy environment. So this saturated fat diet, higher in saturated fat, lower in carb, puts you in a better metabolic state as far as lipids are concerned. Now, next study. Total cholesterol and all-cause mortality, we talked about that, death by all causes, by sex and age, prospective cohort among 12.8 million adults. So almost 13 million people. Now, this was done February 2019. It's they looked at, it was done in Korea. It's the Korean Metabolic Risk Factor Study. Ages 18 to 99 who underwent health examinations from 2001 to 2004. So that's where they got the data. So they looked at relationships between total cholesterol number. As I mentioned, we want it, when you get your total cholesterol number, don't just look at that. You want to look at quality, right? But ideal total cholesterol numbers, and related total cholesterol to mortality, regardless of sex and age. Now, they do have some numbers here for a certain age group, but across the board, they looked at total cholesterol associated with the lowest mortality. So total cholesterol numbers associated with the lowest risk of death by all causes. Okay. All-cause mortality. Their ideal range, they found, was 210 to 249 milligrams per deciliter. Okay, now, so if you've looked at your cholesterol numbers, you've had a doctor look at your cholesterol numbers, they want you under 200, don't they? They want you under 200. It used to be 220, more than 10 years ago, I think. So 220, they want you under 220. Now it's under 200, or they're going to try to threaten you with a statin without really looking at cholesterol quality, or if you even have a, plaque buildup. They'll just say, here's a statin. But so total range associated with lowest risk of death, 210 to 249, 250. You go 250, your doc's going to flip out, right? Most cases, unless you have a very progressive, self-educated in nutrition doc who's taken the time to learn beyond what he's being told by the statin producers. But he's not just been educated by Lipitor reps. But now there was a change for that, except for the youngest groups of men and women. So age 18 to 34, ideal range was 180 to 220, and women 18 to 34, ideal range was 160 to 199. Women age 35 to 44, ideal range was 180 to 220. We're still pushing the boundary because, again, they want under 200. The only people who were under 200 with the ideal cardiovascular range was women 18 to 34. And that might be because that's just typical for women. And you go beyond that, you become a bit of an outlier for that age group and for sex. As a woman who's 1834, if you're above 200, you might just be a kind of an outlier. You might have some other metabolic issues if you push beyond that, basically. 35 to 44, but though, 180 to 220. 220 is still well above where a lot of docs will want you. Same with the men, 18 to 34, 180 to 220, a little above where they want you. But the big news, not too many people under 35 years old are at risk for heart disease, are they? Or death by, or as related to their cholesterol. The greatest risk is generally easily over 35. It's usually 40s, 50s, 60s, right? That group, 210 to 249, lowest risk of death. Now, and their finding was that total cholesterol levels under 200, which is, again, where they want you to get to with their statin, cholesterol numbers under 200 may not necessarily be a sign of good health, just based on their numbers. Looking at, now, again, 12.8 million people in Korea, where maybe the statins just didn't have as much influence over this study, right? It's $1 trillion industry, especially here in the US. 210 to 250. Take that study to your doc. Let him explain it to you. The effect of a high saturated fat, no starch diet on Cirrid lipid subfractions in patients with documented atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So this goes back. It's from November 2003. So basically, it's a high saturated fat, no carb, no starch diet. The effect on their serum lipid again. Okay, who have cardiovascular disease. They already have cardiovascular atherosclerotic. They already have atherosclerosis. They already have plaque and cardiovascular disease forming, and their high saturated fat diet, low carb diet, obviously, or no carb diet, result in weight loss after 6 weeks without adverse effects or negative effects on their serum lipid levels. So that means without negative effects on their cholesterol levels, as verified by nuclear magnetic resonance, which means they were looking at particle numbers. They weren't just doing the standard blood test. They were looking at ApoB particle numbers. And so if you have a lot of small, dense particles, your particle number goes up, that's greater risk. That means you have more triglycerides. You have greater risk of heart disease if you have higher particle size. And the recommendation was further weight loss with a lipid neutral effect may persist for up to 52 weeks. So as far as what they looked at, seemed like with their high saturated fat, no starch diet, they felt like the weight loss would continue for a year with no effect on cholesterol levels. This was done on 20, so it's a small study. It was a small group, 23 obese patients with cardiovascular disease. So no, it's not a lot of people, but they were controlled, right? They were able to manage the intake of their diet. 23 obese with cardiovascular disease. They got weight loss with no negative effects on. And again, think about that. That was almost 20 years ago. How often do you hear about that? Does that ever make the news? No, of course not. That's not what makes headlines, is it? And so they basically concluded. Well, here we go. Saturated fats do not impair endothelial function and arterial stiffness. They don't. This is a great one. So this was from. Let me see. Well, I'm not sure where this is from. I apologize. But I have a link to it. You'll be able to look it up. It'll be in this. All these will be linked in the show notes. The replacement of saturated fatty acids with monounsaturated fatty acids. Okay, now there's nothing wrong with monounsaturated fatty acids, right? That's olive oil, avocado oil. Okay, but they're claimed to be heart healthy, right? They're claimed to be like drink as much as you want, have as much of that oil as you want. It's good for your heart. Extra oil, extra olive oil. Supposed to be so great for your heart, right? And it may be. Okay, that's not the argument. The thing is, they say take that instead of saturated fatty acids, right? So saturated fat. So in this study, though, they replaced saturated fat with monounsaturated fat or excuse me, they replaced monounsaturated fats and carbohydrates with saturated fatty acids, okay, in healthy subjects, and found no negative effects on their vascular function, the function of their cardiovascular system. And this was a parallel designed, randomized controlled trial. This is not an observational epidemiological study, which is the ones we always hear about. Meat's bad, right? Because we asked a bunch of people questions and these are their outcomes. Okay, they looked at 121 insulin-resistant men and women, and they measured their vascular function after 1 month of consuming a high saturated fatty diet. So they're already, they're already insulin resistant. They already have problems with, they be pre-diabetic, let's call them that, right? So they have some insulin resistance going on. They probably already have some lipid irregularities, and they put them on a high saturated fatty acid diet, right? Which would just freak out any doctor or standard nutritionist. If you say, no, we're gonna give more saturated fats, take them off the monounsaturated and the whole grains, right? No more whole grains for you. Reduce the carbs, get rid of the olive oil, have some meat and eggs. That's essentially what they did, right? For 121 people who are already insulin resistant. They measured their vascular function. So the response of the endothelial function of the interior lining of the cardiovascular system, and as it relates to being able to be flexible to contract and expand versus being stiff, arterial stiffness, right? Which is what happens from atherosclerosis. No negative effect. Did not have a problem from switching to the saturated fatty acid diet. Okay. Now here's one from Open Heart 2016. Evidence from randomized controlled trials. Okay, again, more controlled trials, real something you want to like pay attention to versus the epidemiology. Pay closer attention to. Randomized controlled trials does not support current dietary fat guidelines, systematic review and meta-analysis. Okay. They looked at 62,400 participants from 10 different dietary controlled trials. Okay, 10 trials, over 62,000 participants. That's a good section. That's a good group. Good spray there, or spread, if you want to call it that. Current available evidence found no significant difference in all-cause mortality or cardiovascular disease mortality resulting from the dietary fat interventions. So RCT, so randomized controlled trial evidence, that's currently available, okay, does not support the current dietary fat guidelines. So our current dietary fat guidelines are keep saturated fat below 10%, right? Right. This is, again, Open Heart publication 2016, 5 years ago. Current guidelines are not supported by randomized controlled trials. The only way they can find some support for them is through epidemiology, is for food frequency questionnaires. How many cups of ribs have you eaten in the last year? How many times have you eaten meat in the last year? Right, meat, which as far as I'm concerned could be pizza. And do they filter out smoking, alcohol consumption, their sleep habits, their exercise habits? No. Just how many cups of ribs have you had? What a ridiculous question. Who you might ask would write a question like, how many cups of ribs have you eaten in a year? Someone who doesn't eat ribs, right? A vegetarian. Only a vegetarian would measure ribs in a cut, right? Anyway. All right. So beyond cardiovascular disease, the other big fear, if you will, to red meat, right, is cancer. So we've got let me see here. Here we go. So we've got red meat linked to cancer for Asians. Okay, so this was done in Korea or Japan here. I do not remember. But it basically says cancer linked to red meat may not exist for Asians. That's the title of the study. Here's the deal. We don't Asians, okay, so have a lower risk of cancer, right? And most of us kind of have heard that before, seen that in studies. But when Asians move to the United States, their cancer risk does not change. So point is, you don't have, we're not looking at a genetic issue here. It's not just for Asians. It's just the way the headlines decide to kind of put it together, or the way they worded it, okay? Because it was done in Asia on Asians. But they found no risk to red meat consumption for cancer with the people in the study, okay? And obviously there are studies showing there is a risk to cancer. The IARC, which is an international, basic, oh gosh, I'm blanking on what they are called, but you can look up the IARC. They're basically done, give us cancer research or cancer risk, right? Risk of cancer. International Association of something like that for cancer. Sorry, blanking on what the IARC stands for. But here's the point. The IARC doesn't do randomized controlled trials. There are no randomized controlled trials that connect red meat to cancer. Okay, this was a randomized controlled trial. There's nothing related red meat to cancer. The IRC, and even though you've heard it does, right? And it groups it as a group, it puts it as a group 1 carcinogen for humans. Now the IRC doesn't do randomized controlled trials. They only do the food frequency questionnaire. They only do epidemiology, right? So they look at numbers, they're the statistics, and they try to pull these statistics from, a lot of times, asking silly questions. But they put them in a group 1 carcinogen, right? Along with drinking wine, sitting in a sunny window, air. I'm not kidding. That's not a joke. That's what's grouped with those things for cancer, okay? Now, their estimate for cancer, estimated risk for cancer from the IRC for smoking is 1,500 to 3,000% higher for smokers than non-smokers, okay? Now, again, this is an epidemiologic study, show that for every 50-gram increase in processed meat eaten a day, like a bacon, hot dogs, canned meat, sausage, ham, you get processed meat, increases the risk of colorectal cancer by 18%. Okay, so they came up with that number somehow, right? Came up with 18%. Now, just to give you an idea of what 50 grams is, it's about 5 slices of bacon, or the equivalent of meat eaten, and that's for every serving of that amount, right? It's not including whole cuts, like it's not talking about steak, chicken legs, roast, that kind of thing. Not talking about that. Pork chops, ribs, it's not talking about that. It's talking about, this is was strictly about processed meat, right? So it's been reformed. 18% increased risk. That's a relative risk. Now, what you understand is the difference between relative risk and absolute risk. I'm trying to explain this as simply as possible. And that's relative risk, again, eating 50 grams of the processed meat daily, okay? Now, the US average rate or risk, okay, rate really, of colon cancer is 5%. Okay, 5% get colon cancer. It's, according to the study, the rate of colon cancer is 6% if you're eating the processed meat every day. Okay, 6% goes from 5% to 6%. So it's a 1% increase. That's the absolute risk. That's the actual risk. So we're talking about a 1% change. 5% to 6% is an 18% increase. So that's why they said, that's what makes the headlines, the 18% relative risk increase. It goes up by 18% because it went from 5% to 6%. Honestly, we're talking about epidemiology. This is not a randomized controlled trial. There's epidemiology, which is broad. It's just broad. It's not exact. It's not eliminating other risk factors. You had an increase of 1%. It's probably non-existent. More than likely non-existent. It's null. It's not enough of a change to be, it's not a significant enough change to say that this is accurate. The degree of error within the study would be greater than 1%. But yet, yeah, they know that. They know that that is true. They know that no one's going to pay attention if they went from 5%, which is standard, to 6%. Say, hey, yeah, that's probably just a flaw in your study. There's probably no difference. There's no difference. But relative risk of 18%, they just don't, they leave out the relative part. Increase of relative risk, increase of risk by 18%. It went from 5% to 6%. You can remember cancer from smoking, 1,500 to 3,000 from their study. That says, okay, let's take a closer look. Let's take a closer look. If we have that big of an increase, take a closer look. 1%? No. So it's not significant. Again, it's a correlation study, doesn't count, doesn't pull out other risk factors. It's not a significant enough correlation to justify concern. Could be random, could be a fluke. And then there's no RCTs that show a connection between meat and cancer. There's no mechanism or biological pathway shown to show how that would work, how that would cause cancer. There's no biological pathway. But yeah, check out that that study if you're interested in the Asian study. They just basically found no link to Asians who are eating the red meat, and humans are humans. Again, you Asians in the United States get breast cancer, get colorectal cancer, get prostate cancer. It's the same risk as other Americans because they're subject to the same lifestyle, the same food, the same environment. So it has nothing to do with Asians. It has to do with actually doing a study that was not influenced by something else, and other than meat. So I don't want to bog down in the depths of the studies, but here's another one by the it's called the WFO Scientific Council on the consumption of unprocessed. So back to unprocessed red meat. Basically, consumption of unprocessed red meat is not a health risk. This was July of 2021, so it just came out. WFO is a World Farming Organization, World Farmers Organization. It may have been June or July of 2021. Synopsis of 5 significant, recent, and broad-scale scientific investigations on the health risks and health benefits of red meat consumption. Indicates there's no convincing scientific evidence for assertions about harmful health effects of unprocessed meat. If at all, the data very slightly leans toward an association of red meat consumption and protective health benefits. So I mentioned, like before, that study which showed protective benefits against stroke. So they looked at 5 different studies that are recent, broad, health risks and benefits of red meat. No risks, no harmful health effects, quite possibly benefits, protective benefits from red meat consumption. Are you getting the picture here, folks? We had reduction of liver fat. We've had improvement in lipid numbers. And better control over blood sugar. No increased risk with people who already are either obese and or have cardiovascular disease. No increase in cardiovascular disease or impairment to endothelial function, cardiovascular function. No impairment from either a one where they increase saturated fat or a high protein diet or a low carb, higher fat, higher saturated fat diet. They all have one theme, and they all have a similar conclusion. No increased risk, possible protective benefit, which should beg the question, well, then what's causing all the heart disease? And what's causing all the diabetes and the lifestyle disease and the cancer? Great question. So glad you asked. Couple more. Omega-6 vegetable oils as a driver of coronary heart disease, the oxidized linoleic acid hypothesis. So this came out in 2018 in Open Heart of the British Medical Journal, right? Open Heart section of the British Medical Journal. And it was a correlation study. Okay, so they're trying to like, hey, maybe we should look closer at this, trying to create a study where they said, hey, we need to look closer at these oils as a driver of disease. Correlation could point a finger toward a cause that needs to be studied more thoroughly with fewer variables, right? More control over the variables. In summary, numerous lines of evidence show that the omega-6 polyunsaturated fat linoleic acid promotes oxidative stress. Okay, that's rust, that's age, oxidation, peroxidation. Oxidized LDL, we know, very closely related or correlated to cardiovascular disease, if not causing it. Oxidized LDL, chronic low-grade inflammation, and atherosclerosis, and is likely a major dietary culprit for causing coronary heart disease, especially when consumed in the form of industrial seed oils, commonly referred to as vegetable oils, because they're in everything. They're not, even if you don't cook with them, you're probably eating them because the food you're eating is cooked in them. If you go out to a restaurant, it's cooked in them. If you're buying potato chips, it's cooked in them. If you got processed food, you got bread from the store. Anything in a box or bag, can, is probably in there. Canola, corn, soy, cottonseed, right? Safflower, sunflower. They're in there. The hateful eight. Rapeseed. They're in there. And they oxidize, and they oxidize you. They oxidize your cells. They cause lipid peroxidation. So you've got free radicals, reactive oxygen species in there. And that's a problem. That's age. That's breakdown of cell membranes, damage to cell membranes. Okay. So that would cause, and if it's in your vascular system, it's going to cause inflammation. Then your immune system reacts. You start building plaques to shore up the cracks and fissures from and damage from the inflammation. If it's in your organs, that's when you start having damaged cell membranes, damaged organ tissue, cancer. Okay, from the vegetable oils, avoid them at all costs. Cook with lard, cook with saturated fats. It doesn't oxidize. Coconut oil, right? Lard, bacon grease. Get some, if you want, get some tallow. Get some beef tallow, duck fat, something that's solid at room temperature. Butter, obviously, ghee, good stuff. That is not going to oxidize. It's not going to inflame you. And we already shown. Oh, that's saturated fat. Oh, you're not supposed to. Yeah, we just showed. There's no problem with cardiovascular disease. Right? Omega-6 vegetable oils. If you want a little more on that, episode 49 of my podcast, The Trouble with PUFAs, How Omega-6 Oils Are Driving Disease, includes that study and several more. So check that out, episode 49. Other one, consumption of fructose and high fructose corn syrup increase postprandial, that's after a meal, postprandial triglycerides, LDL cholesterol, and apolipoprotein B in young men and women. This is from 2011. Going back 10 years. So increase in post-meal LDL levels, triglycerides, ApoB particles, which is basically more triglycerides. If your particle numbers are going up, it's because you've got small, dense LDL. You don't want high ApoB. You probably have more oxidized LDL as well. With fructose, okay, so this is increased from eating fructose more than just glucose. It's not comparing fructose to fat. It's comparing fructose to glucose. So if you have straight glucose or straight fructose, a lot of these were, well, or with this straight fructose, it's with, they used sugary sodas, basically. They used high fructose corn syrup. So that'd be your sugary sodas being the most common dietary or greatest intake of fructose coming from sodas, right? High fructose corn syrup. Anything sweetened with high fructose corn syrup, that's your fructose, including fruit juice, because that's a lot of fructose as well. It's just juice. There's no fibers, nothing slowing it down. Big impact of sugar. It's the speed with which that sugar is hitting your system that causes a lot of the damage. Because fructose metabolism is not great. It promotes fat storage and low energy and basically reduces ATP, increases fat production, and can create some oxidation. But as we see here, we see increased triglycerides, LDL cholesterol, and apolipoprotein. So the saturated fat did not produce more triglycerides, did not increase LDL cholesterol or more ApoB particles, did it? Remember they did a magnetic resonance in that previous study to look at the apolipoprotein B, ApoB, as it's called. These are in young men and women. So fairly healthy because they're young. God bless them. So they had consumption of high fructose corn sweetened beverages for 2 weeks. Increased risk factors for cardiovascular disease comparably with fructose more than glucose in young adults. That was their conclusion. So basically they had that was the increase from the fructose more than glucose. So basically fructose, as opposed to like a potato, which is glucose, right? They probably gave them liquid just to really differentiate and control it. But you're looking at processed food, which is a lot of high fructose corn syrup and sodas and stuff, versus a whole food like a potato or similar. Pardon me. Forgive me. It's something in the air. How did we get here? Who controls our nutrition guidelines? Why are we having recommendations that saturated fat's going to cause cardiovascular disease and cancer and raise our LDL risk, LDL and triglycerides, when it's not? And we're looking at high fructose corn syrup and seed oils, which are in every other, all the foods along the middle of the aisles, right, along your grocery store, that we're recommended to eat, right? The whole grains, which is cereal, right? Pastas, rice, all these things. So mixes of things, right? Pre-made food. How do we get here? Well, who controls our nutrition guidelines? Who controls them? Nutritionists? Well, they're kind of running the show, technically nutritionists, but there's a golden rule. Who has the gold? He who has the gold makes rules. That's the golden rule, right? So who sponsors the Nutrition Academy? Nutrition Academy, which makes the education, creates the education, and certifies our registered dietitians and educates them. Or the USDA, who makes our nutrition guidelines every 5 years, right? Who controls those? Who sponsors Nutrition Academy? It's a list of several large food conglomerates, international food conglomerates, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, Mars, Procter & Gamble, General Mills, Unilever, Nestle, Kraft Heinz, okay, Kellogg's, and a company you may not have heard of, Mondelez, but it's food, like Oreo. They make Oreos, among other things. All these companies make several, other products that you buy and that are in the grocery stores, all the cereals, the desserts, the drinks. They own them. The condiments, the salad dressings. They own them. They provide funding for our Nutrition Academy. They have contracts with USDA to provide food for our military, hospitals, and schools. That's right. So he who has the gold makes the rules. That's how we got here. So I think you know my conclusion from all this. Of course, draw your own conclusion. At the very least, I'd say there's some reevaluating that needs to be done, but just from the recommendations of these brilliant people who've done these studies, who many of them recommended reevaluating our current studies because they don't reflect what the current randomized controlled trials show. But we need to do some reevaluating of nutrition guidelines, at least on a personal level. Getting it done on a national level or an international level, good luck. National level, really, US, let's face it. Bought and paid for. The diet heart hypothesis, right? And the conviction of red meat and saturated fat, it's really far from settled. As you know, our health authorities would have us believe, as the USDA and the Nutrition Academy would have us, and Harvard Public Health, don't forget about them, would have us believe. They just put something else out. Fortunately, they had a lot of blowback in their post about their little plate. A lot of people saying, I ate like that and I got fat, or I ate like that and I got disease. I would never, there's not enough protein in this to feed an 8-year-old. Things, those kind of comments were getting, they were getting on social media when they put out their recommendations. Absolutely correct. It's absolutely correct. Fortunately, more studies like the ones I've just reviewed are being funded and carried out by researchers who aren't sponsored by the big food industry, who don't have that influence over them. So again, you want to take a closer look at some of these studies. They're involved, and some of them are just an abstract. Some of them show their charts and what they did. Just look for kind of look at an abstract, look at the conclusion. If you don't want to get too caught up in all that, you can certainly dig as deep as you want. But if you want to get the kind of the summary of the researchers, go look at their proposed, what they were looking for, right? It's usually labeled, and then look at their results, or it will be labeled results or conclusion in bold, and you'll see that, and just kind of read through that. It's usually pretty readable. When they start looking at their methods, you might get lost in the weeds. Don't get overwhelmed or intimidated. Look for the conclusion. It's usually written in English, in layman's terms, without a lot of numbers and scribbles, right? So check it out. Draw your own conclusions. Please figure out the diet you need for your health. Do not be intimidated by someone because they have letters after their name who is telling you something that doesn't seem to add up for you, or is telling you this is just the way it is. It's what we've known for 40 years. And it's like they're going off of these observational studies and from authorities that have been, who are funded by processed food companies. Go a little deeper. Let's look at some studies like I've shown here by people who are not on doing them on the dime of processed food industry. So check it out, draw your conclusions. At the very least, balance out get enough protein where you're not chasing, you're not craving all the time. And you can have 2 or 3 meals a day, okay, without being hungry in between. And you're eating whole food. So meat, veggies as tolerated, ones you like, ones you feel which don't upset your stomach, ones you can handle. Fruit, as you can handle it, but not too much. You're trying to lose weight, right? Watch sugar. But don't be afraid of red meat, saturated fat, dietary cholesterol, eggs, right? Eat your beef, eat your pork. It's good for you. Eat your chicken, dark meat. Go for it. You don't have to have dried up chicken breast. Skinless, boneless. I look for bone and skin in just about anything I can get as far as bird goes. And I definitely, if I can find a bone-in piece of meat, grill, wonderful. But don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid of it. Add it to your diet. See how you do. See how satisfied you feel. Okay. And eliminate as much sugar and processed food and refined grains as you possibly can. You want to have a potato here and there. That's a whole food. Okay. Not potatoes, multiple, but potato with your meat and your veggies or a fruit for dessert. Great. All whole food. Start with there, and then kind of balance it out as you need to for your weight loss or your muscle gain or whatever it is you need to keep up with your activity level or your health goals. Whole food. You will eliminate a lot of the garbage that is causing these problems like the processed seed oils and the high fructose corn syrup. You will eliminate a lot of those, and you will be in a much better place to move forward and figure out what you actually need, because you're going to be looking at, when you make that decision in as far as ratio of your macros, you'll be looking at whole food, and you have a much better result and reaction from your body. Have a great week.